A lonely rancher saved a bleeding Omaha woman from the treacherous depths of Snake Gulch, where rattlers nested and men feared to tread. By dawn, 30 painted braves rode hard across his land, war paint fresh and rifles gleaming in the morning. Sun, the Nebraska territory stretched endlessly under a merciless August sun, the kind of heat that made mirages dance on the horizon and turned the earth to cracked leather beneath a man's boots. Kane Ridgway had learned to read the signs of this unforgiving land during his 8 years working the Triple R Ranch, watching how the wind shifted before a storm, how the cattle bunched together when predators prowled, how silence could mean either peace or the moment before everything went to hell.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Kane was 34 years old, built lean and hard from years of wrestling steers and mending fences, his hands scarred from barbed wire and his face weathered to the color of saddle leather. He'd come west after the war, carrying nothing but a cavalry saber, a Springfield rifle, and memories he preferred to keep buried. The ranch he'd bought with his mustering out pay sat in a valley 20 miles from the nearest settlement, bordered on one side by the Platte River, and on the other by the jagged maze of canyons and gulches that the locals called Devil's Backbone. Most folks avoided Devil's Backbone, especially the deep ravine known as Snake Gulch. The canyon earned its name honestly, serving as a winter den for more rattlesnakes than a man could count, but it also held the only reliable water source. For 50 miles during the dry months, Kane had lost 3 head of cattle to that cursed place over the years, beasts that wandered too close to the rim and tumbled down the sheer rock walls, their bones picked clean by vultures and their hides claimed by the desert. On this particular morning, Kane was riding the northern boundary of his spread, checking fence lines that the summer heat had warped and split. His buckskin gelding Ranger picked his way carefully along the rocky trail that skirted the edge of Snake Gulch, ears pricked forward and nostrils flaring at scents carried on the hot wind. The horse had good instincts, and Kane had learned to trust them after 8 years of partnership. When Ranger suddenly stopped and refused to move forward, his entire body going rigid with tension, Kane knew something was wrong. The silence was what struck him first, not the natural quiet of the high desert, but the unnatural hush that fell when every living creature sensed danger and went still. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the brush, not even the drone of insects that usually filled the air. Kane dismounted slowly, his hand moving instinctively to the Colt Navy revolver on his hip, and approached the canyon rim on foot. What he saw below made his blood run cold. 40 feet down the rocky slope, caught on a narrow ledge barely 3 feet wide, was a woman. She lay motionless on her side, her long black hair spread like a dark fan across the stone. And even from this distance, Kane could see the crimson stain spreading across the back of her buckskin dress. Her position was precarious, one arm dangling over the edge of the ledge, and Kane realized that any movement could send her tumbling. Another 100 feet to the canyon floor, where the rattlesnakes made their dens. Kane's mind raced as he studied the treacherous descent. The walls of Snake Gulch were nearly vertical, carved by centuries of flash floods into smooth, unforgiving stone. Most men would have ridden for help, but Kane knew the nearest town was a full day's ride, and the woman didn't have that kind of time. Blood loss, exposure, or a single wrong movement would kill her long before rescue could arrive. He secured his rope to Ranger's saddle horn and tested the knots twice before tying the other end around his waist. The descent would be dangerous even for an experienced climber, and one mistake would mean death for both of them. Kane had done his share of dangerous things during the war, rappelling down bluffs to scout Confederate positions and scaling fortress walls under cover of darkness. But this felt different. This wasn't about military objectives or following orders. This was about whether he could live with himself if he rode away and left a woman to die. The first 20 feet went smoothly, Kane using his boots to find purchase on small ledges and cracks in the rock face. But as he descended further, the stone became smoother, polished by wind and water until it offered no grip at all. Twice he slipped, the rope burning through his gloves as he caught himself. Small avalanches of loose rock clattering down into the depths below. Sweat poured down his face despite the morning chill, and his shoulders ached from the strain of controlling his descent. When Kane finally reached the ledge, he could see the full extent of the woman's injuries. A deep gash ran from her left shoulder blade to the middle of her back, the wound still seeping blood that had already soaked through her dress and pooled on the stone beneath her. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and her skin had taken on the pale, waxy look that Kane recognized from battlefield experience. She was unconscious but alive. Though barely, Kane examined the ledge carefully before moving. The stone platform was solid enough, but narrow. With barely room for two people, he would have to rig a harness to get her up the cliff face, and any mistake would send them both tumbling into the serpent-infested depths below. Working quickly but methodically, Kane removed his shirt and tore it into strips, using the cloth to fashion a crude harness around the woman's torso. As he worked, Kane noticed details that puzzled him. Her dress was beautifully crafted, the buckskin soft and supple, decorated with intricate beadwork and patterns he didn't recognize. Silver bracelets adorned her wrists, and a necklace of polished stones hung around her throat. This wasn't the clothing of a frontier woman or a settler's wife. The workmanship spoke of tribal artistry, but Kane couldn't place which nation might have created such fine work. More puzzling still was her location. Snake Gulch was miles from any established trail, and the nearest Omaha settlements were supposed to be far to the north. What was a lone woman doing in this desolate country? And how had she come to fall into the most dangerous canyon in the territory? Kane pushed these questions aside as he focused on the immediate problem of keeping them both alive. The ascent proved even more treacherous than the descent. Kane had to climb one-handed, supporting the unconscious woman's weight while maintaining his grip on the rope. 3 times loose rock gave way beneath his boots, sending him swinging against the cliff face with bone-jarring impact. The woman remained mercifully unconscious throughout the ordeal, her dead weight making every foot of progress a struggle. By the time Kane hauled them both over the rim of the canyon, his arms were shaking with exhaustion, and his hands were raw and bleeding despite his gloves. He lay on the solid ground for several minutes, catching his breath and letting his heart rate return to normal. The woman lay beside him, still unconscious but breathing more steadily now that she was away from the ledge. Kane lifted her carefully and placed her across Ranger's saddle, securing her with the remaining rope to prevent her from falling during the ride back to the ranch. The horse seemed to understand the urgency of the situation, picking his way along the rough trail with unusual care. Every jarring step made Kane wince in sympathy, knowing the woman's injuries were being aggravated by the movement. But staying in the canyon wasn't an option. The ride back to the RRR felt like the longest journey of Kane's life. He kept one hand on the woman's back, feeling for the rise and fall of her breathing, terrified that she might slip away before he could get her to safety. The sun climbed higher as they traveled, turning the Nebraska grassland into a shimmering furnace, and Kane found himself rationing water from his canteen, using precious drops to moisten the woman's lips. The ranch buildings appeared like a mirage through the heat haze. The simple log cabin and barn that Kane had built with his own hands, suddenly looking like the most beautiful sight in the world. He carried the woman inside and laid her carefully on his bed, then set about the grim business of treating her wounds. Kane had learned field medicine during the war, patching up wounded soldiers when the surgeon was overwhelmed or unavailable. But this was different. This was personal in a way that battlefield injuries had never been. He heated water on the stove and gathered clean cloth for bandages, his movements quick and efficient, despite the tremor in his hands. The woman's dress would have to be cut away to reach the wound, and Kane hesitated for a moment, conscious of the impropriety, but knowing her life depended on proper treatment.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Working as carefully and respectfully as possible, he exposed the gash and began the delicate process of cleaning and stitching. The torn flesh, the injury was deep but clean, probably caused by a sharp rock during her fall into the canyon. Cain counted himself lucky that no vital organs appeared to be damaged, though she had lost a significant amount of blood. As he worked, stitching the wound with the fine thread he used for mending tack, Cain found himself studying the woman's face. She was young, probably no more than 25, with high cheekbones and a strong jawline that spoke of both beauty and character. When the immediate medical work was finished, Cain covered her with his best blanket and sat back to consider his situation. He had a mysterious woman recovering in his bed, someone who clearly came from a tribal background but whose presence in Snake Gulch raised more questions than answers. More troubling still was the nagging feeling that her appearance on his land might not be the end of his problems, but only the beginning. Cain spent the rest of the day tending to his unexpected patient, checking her temperature and pulse, forcing small amounts of water between her lips whenever she showed signs of consciousness. As evening approached, he prepared a simple meal of beef broth and cornbread, hoping she might be able to eat something when she finally awakened. The woman remained unconscious but stable, her breathing deep and regular, color slowly returning to her pale cheeks. As night fell over the Nebraska territory, Cain sat in his single chair beside the bed, his rifle across his knees and his thoughts troubled. Something about this entire situation felt orchestrated, as if forces beyond his understanding were moving pieces on a board he couldn't see. The woman's presence in Snake Gulch, her obvious tribal heritage, the quality of her clothing and jewelry all suggested a story more complex than a simple accident. Cain had learned to trust his instincts during the war, and those instincts were telling him that saving this woman's life might have consequences he couldn't yet imagine. But as he watched her sleep, noting the way moonlight streaming through the window softened her features, he found he didn't regret his choice. Some things were worth the risk, and preserving human life was chief among them. The night passed slowly, punctuated by the woman's occasional restless movements and Cain's vigilant monitoring of her condition. Twice she seemed on the verge of waking, her eyelids fluttering and lips moving as if she were trying to speak, but consciousness remained elusive. Cain found himself dozing in his chair despite his best efforts to stay alert, exhaustion finally claiming him as the first pale light of dawn crept across the eastern horizon. It was the sound of horses that woke him, many horses, moving at speed across the hard ground of his ranch. Cain's eyes snapped open, and he was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the window with the practiced stealth of a man who had survived 4 years of warfare. What he saw in the growing light made his blood freeze in his veins. 30 Omaha warriors sat their painted ponies in a perfect semicircle around his cabin, their faces streaked with war paint, their weapons gleaming in the early morning sun. They made no sound, issued no challenges, simply waited with the terrible patience of men who had come to collect what belonged to them. In the center of the group sat a figure Cain recognized even at a distance as a war chief, his elaborate headdress and bearing marking him as a leader of considerable importance. Cain's mind raced as he processed the implications of what he was seeing. The woman in his bed was clearly important to these warriors, important enough for them to track her across miles of hostile territory and surround a heavily armed rancher's cabin. But their restraint puzzled him. If they had simply wanted to retrieve her by force, they could have attacked under cover of darkness. Instead, they waited, as if bound by some code of honor that required negotiation rather than violence. The woman stirred behind him, and Cain turned to see her eyes opening for the first time since he had pulled her from Snake Gulch. Her gaze was immediately alert and focused, taking in her surroundings and her situation with an intelligence that confirmed his suspicion. that there was far more to her story than a simple accident. When she saw Cain standing at the window with his rifle, her expression shifted from confusion to something that might have been gratitude, or perhaps regret. "You need to stay down," Cain said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are 30 armed warriors outside, and I'm guessing they're here for you." The woman tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her stitches, but her eyes never left his face. There was a strength in her gaze that spoke of someone accustomed to facing danger, someone who had made hard choices and lived with the consequences. "My name is Senna Ghosthorse," she said, her voice hoarse but steady, "and you are in more danger than you know." Cain noticed her English was flawless, educated, with only the slightest trace of an accent that suggested tribal languages as her first tongue. This was no simple plainswoman, but someone who moved between worlds, someone with connections and influence. Cain kept his position at the window, studying the warriors outside while listening to her words. "They've been tracking me for 3 days," Senna continued, struggling to prop herself up on one elbow despite the obvious pain. "I thought I had lost them in the maze of canyons. But the Omaha are the finest trackers on the plains. They can follow a trail across solid rock if they have to." "Why are they tracking you?" Cain asked, though he suspected the answer would complicate his life considerably. Senna's laugh was bitter, tinged with pain both physical and emotional. "Because I broke the most sacred law of my people. I refused to marry the man my father chose, a man who would unite our band with a more powerful tribe through political alliance." The implications of her words hit Cain like a physical blow. In many tribal cultures, such a refusal would be seen as treason, a betrayal that threatened the survival of the entire community. "And your father is," Cain began, though he already suspected the answer. "War Chief Thunderbear," Senna confirmed, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. The man sitting in the center of that line of warriors, wearing the eagle feather headdress. Cain's blood ran cold. As he processed this information, he wasn't just harboring a runaway woman. He was harboring the daughter of one of the most powerful war chiefs in the territory. Thunderbear's reputation extended far beyond the Omaha tribe. His skill as a warrior and leader, earning respect even from his enemies. This was a man who had never lost a battle, who had united fractured bands into a formidable force, who could call upon hundreds of warriors if the situation demanded it. "The man I was promised to," Senna continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, "is named Iron Hawk, son of Chief Standing Wolf of the Northern Bands. The marriage would create an alliance between our peoples, combining Thunderbear's tactical genius with Standing Wolf's vast herds and hunting grounds. It would make them the most powerful confederation on the northern plains." Cain understood tribal politics well enough to grasp the significance of what she was telling him. Such an alliance would shift the balance of power across the entire territory, potentially threatening white settlements and changing the dynamics of trade and warfare for hundreds of miles. Senna's refusal wasn't just personal rebellion. It was an act that could alter the fate of thousands of people. "But Iron Hawk is not a good man," Senna said, her voice hardening with remembered pain. "He has 3 wives already, all beaten into submission, all bearing the scars of his cruelty. The last one, a girl barely 16, died during childbirth because he would not allow her to receive proper care from the medicine women. He said weakness must be burned out of his bloodline." Cain felt his jaw clench as he listened to her story. He had seen enough cruelty during the war to recognize the type of man she described. The kind who confused brutality with strength, who saw others as possessions rather than people. "So you ran," he said simply, and Senna nodded. 3 nights ago, during the feast celebrating our betrothal, I slipped away while the men were drinking and the women were busy with preparations. I thought if I could reach the white settlements, I might find sanctuary, or at least delay the marriage long enough to change my father's mind. But you ended up in Snake Gulch instead." Cain observed, and Senna's expression grew grim. I was being pursued by Iron Hawk himself and a party of his warriors. They had tracked me to the canyon rim, and I thought I could escape by climbing down and following the canyon floor to the river. I underestimated the difficulty of the descent. Cain could picture the desperate escape attempt. A young woman clinging to treacherous rock faces while armed warriors searched for her above. The fall that had nearly killed her had probably saved her life, hiding her from her pursuers long enough for them to lose her trail. Iron Hawk believes I died in the canyon, Senna continued. He returned to our village to report my death to Thunder Bear, but my father is not easily convinced. He sent his best trackers to verify Iron Hawk's story. And they found signs that you survived, Cain finished. Understanding dawning in his mind, Senna nodded gravely. Omaha trackers can read a story in disturbed earth and broken twigs that would be invisible to other men. They followed the trail of my rescue to your ranch. And now they wait for my father to decide what justice demands. Cain absorbed this information while continuing to monitor the warriors outside. They remained motionless, their discipline absolute, but he could sense the tension coiled in their stillness. These were men prepared for violence, but bound by honor to follow their leader's commands. What does your father want? Cain asked, though he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. He wants me returned to fulfill my obligations to the tribe, Senna replied, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. Thunder Bear is a fair man, but he is also a leader who must put the needs of his people above personal feelings. The alliance with Standing Wolf's band would provide security and prosperity for hundreds of families. My personal happiness is a small price to pay for such benefits. Cain understood the logic even as he despised it. In a harsh world where survival often depended on group solidarity, individual desires were luxuries few could afford. But understanding didn't make the situation any more palatable. And if I refuse to give you up? He asked, though he already knew the answer would seal both their fates. Then you will be seen as an enemy of the Omaha people, Senna said simply. Thunder Bear will not allow a white man to interfere with tribal law, no matter how good your intentions might be. He will give you one chance to return me willingly, with honor intact on both sides. If you refuse, 30 warriors will ensure that his daughter comes home, and your interference will be permanently ended. Cain weighed his options with the grim calculation of a man who had faced impossible choices before. He could return Senna to her father and condemn her to a life of brutality at Iron Hawk's hands. He could refuse and face certain death in a battle he could never win. Or he could try to find a third option. Though none presented itself readily. There's another possibility, Senna said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. Among my people, if a woman is claimed by a warrior who defeats her intended husband in combat, the original betrothal is considered void. The victor takes both the woman and the alliance benefits that come with her. Cain turned from the window to stare at her, understanding the implications of what she was suggesting. You're asking me to challenge Iron Hawk to single combat, Cain said, his voice flat with disbelief. A man I've never met, trained from childhood in tribal warfare, who has never lost a fight. Senna met his gaze steadily. I'm offering you the only honorable path that might save both our lives. If you defeat Iron Hawk, I become your wife by tribal law, and the alliance benefits transfer to you. Thunder Bear gains a formidable warrior son-in-law instead of Iron Hawk. And the political objectives are still achieved. The audacity of the proposal left Cain speechless for a moment. She was suggesting he stake his life on single combat against a legendary warrior, with her hand and the future of tribal politics hanging in the balance. It was like something from the old stories, the kind of desperate gamble that heroes made in ancient legends. And if I lose? Cain asked, though he already knew the answer. Then Iron Hawk claims me as his prize, and you die honorably in combat, rather than being executed as a kidnapper. Senna replied with brutal honesty. It is not a good option, but it is the Only option that offers any hope of escape. Cain returned his attention to the window. Studying the warriors with new eyes, he could see Iron Hawk now, a massive figure on a black warhorse. Positioned slightly apart from Thunder Bear's warriors, the man's bearing radiated arrogance and cruelty, confirming everything Senna had told him about her unwanted betrothed. Even at a distance, Cain could sense the brutality that lurked beneath Iron Hawk's carefully controlled exterior. How much time do I have to decide? Cain asked, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. Thunder Bear is a patient man, but not infinitely so, Senna replied. He will wait until the sun reaches its peak, giving you time to consider your position and make an honorable choice. After that, his patience will be exhausted, and he will take direct action, Cain calculated quickly. The sun was perhaps 3 hours from its zenith, giving him precious little time to prepare for what might be the most important decision of his life. He could spend those hours planning an escape that would likely end in failure and death, or he could use them to prepare for a battle that offered at least a slim chance of survival. If I agree to this challenge, Cain said slowly, what are the rules of combat? Senna's expression brightened slightly, the first sign of hope he had seen in her eyes. Traditional single combat allows the challenged party to choose weapons. Iron Hawk will likely choose tomahawks and knives, weapons he has mastered through years of training, but you would have the right to propose an alternative. Cain's mind immediately went to his Springfield rifle and Colt revolver, weapons that would give him a significant advantage over traditional tribal arms, but he suspected such modern firearms would be considered dishonorable in formal combat. What about cavalry sabers? He asked, thinking of the blade that hung above his fireplace, the weapon that had served him through 4 years of war. Senna considered this possibility carefully. It is unusual, but not unprecedented. Some warriors have adopted white man's weapons and techniques. If you can convince Thunder Bear that blade combat is your traditional fighting style, he might allow it. Iron Hawk's pride would prevent him from refusing such a challenge. Cain felt a flicker of hope for the first time since awakening to find his cabin surrounded. He had been one of the finest saber fighters in his regiment, his skill with the blade earning recognition even among the elite cavalry units. Against tomahawks and knives, a trained swordsman with reach and technique advantages might have a genuine chance. The sound of a voice calling out in the Omaha language interrupted his thoughts. Thunder Bear was speaking, his words carrying clearly across the morning air despite the distance. Senna translated quickly. My father says the sun has moved, and his patience grows thin. He offers you one final chance to return his daughter and depart with your honor intact. Cain made his decision with the decisive clarity that had kept him alive through countless battles. Tell me exactly what words I need to say to issue the challenge, he said, checking his weapons and mentally preparing for what would either be his greatest victory or his final fight. Cain stepped onto his cabin porch with deliberate slowness, his cavalry saber hanging at his side and his hands held where the warriors could see them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty ground between him and the semicircle of mounted Omaha fighters, each one a study in controlled violence waiting for their war chief's command. Thunder Bear sat his painted stallion like a statue carved from granite, his weathered face betraying nothing as he watched the white rancher emerge from the cabin that sheltered his runaway daughter. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring as Cain walked forward 10 paces, stopping just beyond rifle range but close enough for his voice to carry clearly. He had rehearsed the words Senna taught him, practicing the unfamiliar sounds of the Omaha language until he could speak them with confidence. What he was about to do would either save both their lives or ensure they died together, but it was the only path that offered any hope of honor. Thunder Bear, great war chief of the Omaha people, Cain called out in English first, his voice carrying across the still morning air. I speak your words with respect. Then, switching to the carefully memorized Omaha phrases, He continued with the formal challenge that would change everything. The effect on the assembled warriors was immediate and electric, several of them shifting restlessly in their saddles as the implications of his words sank in. Thunder Bear's expression flickered with what might have been surprise, quickly replaced by calculating assessment. For a white man to know the proper forms of tribal challenge suggested either extensive contact with native peoples or careful preparation. Either way, it demonstrated respect for Omaha traditions that demanded acknowledgement. The war chief urged his horse forward several steps, closing the distance between them while maintaining the formal positioning that such negotiations required. "White man who speaks our words," Thunder Bear replied in heavily accented but clear English. "You shelter my daughter who has broken the sacred bonds of her betrothal. The law of our people demands her return to face the consequences of her actions. Why do you stand between a father and his child?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words, testing Kane's understanding of the cultural forces at play. Kane had expected this challenge to his right to interfere in tribal affairs, and Senna had coached him on the proper response. "Great Chief, I claim the ancient right of sanctuary for one who sought shelter in my lodge while wounded and bleeding. Among your people, as among mine, such hospitality creates obligations that honor demands be fulfilled. I cannot return her to harm while she remains under my protection." The answer clearly impressed several of the younger warriors, who murmured among themselves in recognition of the code Kane had invoked. Thunder Bear himself nodded slightly, acknowledging the legitimacy of the claim while his eyes remained cold and calculating. "The sanctuary you claim is valid for healing," the war chief conceded. "But healing is finished. My daughter can ride. She can speak. She can perceive judgment of her people. Your obligation is complete." Kane felt the trap closing around him as Thunder Bear's logic cornered him into an untenable position. But this was exactly the moment Senna had prepared him for, the precise opening he needed to make his desperate gamble. "Great Chief, your daughter tells me she was promised to Iron Hawk of the Northern Bands," Kane said, his voice carrying clearly to every warrior present. "I invoke the right of challenge for the hand of Senna Ghost Horse." The reaction was instantaneous and dramatic. Several horses reared as their riders expressed shock and anger in the Omaha language, their voices rising in a mixture of outrage and disbelief. No white man had ever dared invoke such ancient privileges, and the audacity of the challenge struck the assembled warriors like a physical blow. Thunder Bear himself seemed momentarily stunned by the unprecedented nature of Kane's declaration. But it was Iron Hawk's response that dominated the scene. The massive warrior's face contorted with rage as he understood the implications of Kane's words, his entire body radiating violence barely held in check. "White dog," Iron Hawk snarled in broken English, "you dare claim what belongs to Iron Hawk. You know nothing of our ways, nothing of our strength. I will feed your heart to the buzzards." Kane forced himself to remain calm despite every instinct screaming at him to prepare for immediate violence. Iron Hawk's reputation as a berserker in combat was well known throughout the territory, and the man's barely controlled fury suggested that reputation was well earned. But Kane had faced dangerous men before, and he knew that anger could be both a weapon and a weakness depending on how it was channeled. Thunder Bear raised his hand for silence, his authority absolute, despite the explosive tension crackling through the air. "Iron Hawk, contain your anger," the war chief commanded in English, ensuring both parties understood his words. "This white man has invoked ancient law, and ancient law must be respected. If his challenge is made properly, it must be answered properly." The war chief turned his attention back to Kane, his weathered features revealing nothing of his thoughts. "White man, you speak of challenge, but do you understand what you invoke? The right of combat for a woman's hand is not a game to be played lightly. It is a sacred test that binds the victor to responsibilities beyond your understanding. Do you accept these obligations?" Cain had discussed this moment extensively with Senna, understanding that his answer would determine not just his immediate fate but the course of his entire future. Great Chief, I understand that victory would make Senna Ghosthorse my wife according to your laws. Cain replied formally. I understand that I would be bound to protect her, provide for her, and honor the alliances that come with such a union. I accept these responsibilities willingly. Thunder Bear studied Cain for long moments, his experienced eyes reading character and determination in ways that few men could match. What he saw must have satisfied some internal standard, because he finally nodded once. The challenge is properly made and properly accepted. The war chief declared, Iron Hawk, do you accept this contest for the woman promised to you? Iron Hawk's response was a roar of fury that spooked several horses and sent a flock of crows exploding from a nearby tree. I accept, he snarled, his hand moving to the tomahawk at his belt. I will show this white fool what happens to men who reach for things beyond their station. His bones will bleach in the sun as a warning to others. Thunder Bear again called for silence, his authority cutting through Iron Hawk's rage like a blade. The challenge is accepted by both parties. He announced formally, the combat will take place when the sun reaches its highest point, giving both warriors time to prepare themselves according to their traditions. Iron Hawk, as the challenged party, you may choose the weapons and terms of combat. Cain felt his stomach tighten as Iron Hawk's lips curved in a cruel smile. This was the moment that would determine whether his desperate gamble had any chance of success. We fight as warriors have always fought, Iron Hawk declared, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Tomahawk and knife, no other weapons. Combat continues until one man cannot rise again. But Cain was ready for this moment, having planned his response carefully with Senna's guidance. Great Chief, he said formally, among my people, warriors fight with the long blade according to our ancient traditions. I request the right to meet this challenge with the weapon of my ancestors. As Iron Hawk fights with the weapons of his, the request sparked immediate debate among the assembled warriors. Their voices rise in an animated discussion of the precedent and propriety of allowing such a deviation from traditional combat. Thunder Bear listened to the arguments for several minutes before raising his hand for silence once again. Iron Hawk, he said finally, the white man requests to fight with his traditional weapon as you fight with yours. Do you accept this variation, or do you insist on tomahawk and knife? Cain held his breath as Iron Hawk considered the question, knowing that the warrior's pride and arrogance might be his salvation. Refusing the request would make Iron Hawk appear afraid of facing an unfamiliar weapon, while accepting it would demonstrate supreme confidence in his abilities. Either response could work in Cain's favor, but for different reasons. Let him bring his long blade, Iron Hawk finally declared with contemptuous dismissal. Iron Hawk has killed men with swords before. Their extra reach means nothing when a true warrior gets inside their guard. I will show these people how easily white man's weapons break against Indian steel. Thunder Bear nodded his acceptance of the terms, then turned his attention to the practical arrangements. The combat circle will be marked 50 paces from this spot, he announced, gesturing toward a level area of ground clear of rocks and obstacles. Both warriors will have 2 hours to prepare themselves according to their customs. Medicine men will attend each fighter to ensure the contest is fair and honorable. As the warriors began dismounting to prepare the fighting ground, Cain caught sight of a figure he hadn't noticed before. An elderly Omaha man with intricate tattoos covering his arms and chest was approaching Thunder Bear, his bearing suggesting spiritual authority rather than military rank. This would be Standing Wolf, the medicine man whose blessing would be required for the combat to proceed. Senna had warned Cain about the medicine man's role in formal challenges, explaining that Standing Wolf wielded influence equal to Thunder Bear's in matters involving spiritual law. The old man's approval of the combat would legitimize the proceedings, while his disapproval could end everything before it began. Cain watched nervously as Standing Wolf and Thunder Bear engaged in animated discussion. The medicine man questions whether a white man can truly understand the spiritual significance of what he attempts. Senna's voice came from behind Cain as she approached on unsteady legs, having insisted on leaving the cabin despite her injuries. Standing Wolf believes that marriage alliances among the Omaha carry responsibilities to the ancestors and the unborn generations that an outsider cannot comprehend. Cain turned to support Senna as she swayed slightly, the effort of walking clearly taxing her limited strength. "What can I do to convince him?" Cain asked quietly. Aware that several warriors were watching their interaction with keen interest, Senna studied the medicine man's animated gestures as he continued his discussion with Thunder Bear. Standing Wolf is a practical man despite his spiritual authority. Senna replied thoughtfully, "He knows that alliances must sometimes adapt to changing circumstances. If you can demonstrate proper respect for our customs and understanding of the obligations you're accepting, he might approve the combat." As if summoned by their conversation, Standing Wolf detached himself from Thunder Bear and approached Cain with the measured pace of a man accustomed to inspiring both respect and fear. His weathered features revealed nothing of his thoughts, but his dark eyes seemed to peer directly into Cain's soul. When he spoke, his English was precise and formal. "White man who would be Omaha," Standing Wolf said without preamble. "You seek to claim a daughter of our people through ancient law, but law without understanding is like a river without banks, destructive rather than nourishing. Tell me what you know of the obligations you accept." Cain had rehearsed this moment with Senna, understanding that his answer would determine whether the combat could proceed. "Honored medicine man," he replied formally, "I understand that marriage among your people creates bonds not just between a man and woman, but between their families and their spirits. I know that I would be responsible for Senna's welfare in this life and her honor in the next. I know that any children we might have would belong to both our peoples and must be raised to honor both traditions." Standing Wolf listened intently, his expression giving away nothing of his assessment. "You speak words taught by my granddaughter," he said finally, "but words are like leaves in the wind without roots in the heart. Why do you risk your life for a woman you met one day ago? What drives you to challenge a warrior whose skill is legendary among all the Plains tribes?" The question struck to the heart of Cain's motivations, forcing him to examine his own reasons for making such a desperate gamble. "Because I have seen enough cruelty in my life," Cain replied honestly. "I fought in a war where men died for causes they barely understood, and I have spent years trying to find meaning in that suffering. When I pulled Senna from Snake Gulch, I saw someone who reminded me that there are still things worth protecting in this world." Standing Wolf's eyes narrowed as he studied Cain's face, searching for signs of deception or weakness. "And if you defeat Iron Hawk, but Senna refuses to accept you as husband?" the medicine man asked. "What then? Will you force her to honor a bargain she did not make?" Cain glanced at Senna, seeing something in her expression that gave him courage to speak from his heart. "If I am fortunate enough to survive the combat, Senna will be free to choose her own path," Cain said firmly. "I fight to prevent her forced marriage to a cruel man, not to force her into marriage with me. Her freedom is the prize I seek, not her submission." For the first time since beginning his questioning, Standing Wolf's stern expression softened slightly. "These are the words of a man who understands the true nature of honor," the medicine man said approvingly. "Very well. White warrior, you may face Iron Hawk with my blessing, but know that the spirits of our ancestors will be watching, and they do not forgive those who mock sacred traditions." The medicine man's approval sent a ripple of acceptance through the assembled warriors, legitimizing Cain's challenge in ways that Thunder Bear's political acknowledgement could not. But it also meant that there was no retreat from the path he had chosen. In less than 2 hours, he would face one of the most dangerous fighters on the northern plains in single combat, with his life and Senna's freedom hanging in the balance. As the warriors finished marking the combat circle and began their preparations, Cain felt the weight of his decision settling over him like a lead blanket. He had committed himself to a course of action that offered only the slimmest chance of survival. Driven by principles he wasn't sure he could articulate even to himself. But as he looked at Senna's grateful expression and remembered Iron Hawk's cruel reputation, Cain knew he had made the only choice his conscience would allow. The 2 hours that Thunderbear had granted for preparation passed like minutes in Cain's mind, each moment bringing him closer to a confrontation that would determine not just his fate, but the future of everyone involved. While the Omaha warriors constructed a formal fighting circle using stakes and rawhide rope, Cain retreated to his cabin to ready himself for what might be the last battle of his life. Senna followed him inside, her movements still careful, due to her injuries, but her presence providing a steadying influence he desperately needed. Cain's cavalry saber hung above the fireplace where it had rested untouched for 3 years, a relic of a war he had tried his best to forget. The blade was a regulation 1840 pattern saber, its curved steel bearing the subtle marks of combat, use and careful maintenance. During the war, this weapon had saved Cain's life more times than he could count, its balance and reach giving him crucial advantages in the chaos of mounted combat. Now he lifted it reverently, feeling the familiar weight settle into his hand like an old friend returning home. "Tell me about Iron Hawk's fighting style," Cain said as he began the ritual of preparing his weapon, checking the edge and testing the flex of the steel. Senna settled into his single chair, watching his methodical preparations with the intense focus of someone whose life depended on the outcome. "He is a berserker in the old tradition," she replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Iron Hawk draws strength from rage, using fury to overwhelm opponents before they can establish defensive positions." Cain nodded as he stropped the saber's edge to razor sharpness. Having faced such fighters during the war, berserkers could be incredibly dangerous in the opening moments of combat, their aggressive style catching opponents off guard and ending fights quickly. But they also had weaknesses that a disciplined opponent could exploit if he survived the initial assault. "What weapons does he prefer?" Cain asked, continuing his methodical preparation. "Iron Hawk carries a war tomahawk forged by the finest smiths among the northern bands," Senna explained, her eyes distant as she recalled previous combats she had witnessed. "The head is made from meteor iron traded from the Lakota, harder than any steel the white man knows. Its handle is carved from ironwood and wrapped with the hide of a grizzly bear he killed with his bare hands as a young warrior. The weapon has never failed him in combat." Cain absorbed this information while continuing to work on his saber, understanding that Iron Hawk's tomahawk would be both a formidable weapon and a source of spiritual power. Many tribal warriors believed their weapons carried the spirits of previous victories, drawing strength from past triumphs. "And his knife?" Cain prompted, knowing that most plains warriors fought with paired weapons. "A bone-handled blade as long as a man's forearm, made from the same meteor iron as his tomahawk," Senna continued. "Iron Hawk took it from a Crow warrior he defeated in single combat 5 years ago, adding the previous owner's power to his own. Together, the tomahawk and knife have claimed the lives of 17 men in formal duels." The number sent a chill down Cain's spine as he considered the level of experience he was facing. Iron Hawk wasn't just physically formidable. He was a veteran killer who had perfected his techniques through years of mortal combat. Cain's own military experience was extensive, but most of his fighting had involved firearms and mounted tactics rather than the intimate brutality of hand-to-hand combat. "How does he typically begin his attacks?" Cain asked, moving on to examine his clothing and equipment for anything that might hinder his movement. Senna closed her eyes, apparently visualizing combats she had witnessed. "Iron Hawk likes to circle his opponent first, testing their nerve and looking for signs of weakness. He makes false charges to gauge reaction time, then commits to a full assault when he identifies an opening." Cain stripped off his work shirt and selected a clean cotton undershirt that would absorb sweat without binding his movements. Over this he donned a leather vest that would provide some protection against slashing attacks while maintaining flexibility. His cavalry boots were sturdy enough to provide ankle support, but flexible enough to allow the quick footwork that saber combat demanded. Once Iron Hawk commits to attack, he becomes like a force of nature, Senna continued, her voice growing tense as she described the warrior's combat style. He moves with incredible speed for such a large man, using his tomahawk to break through defensive positions while his knife seeks vital areas. Most opponents become so focused on avoiding the tomahawk that they forget about the knife until it finds their heart. Cain tested his range of motion, practicing the basic cuts and thrusts that had been drilled into him. During cavalry training, the movements felt awkward after 3 years of disuse, but muscle memory was beginning to reassert itself as he worked through the familiar sequences. Saber combat was as much about timing and distance as raw skill, requiring split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. Tell me about his weaknesses, Cain said as he moved through a complex series of parries and ripostes, feeling his body remember the deadly dance of steel. On steel, Senna watched his movements with growing interest, apparently recognizing competence despite his obvious rustiness. Ironhawk's greatest weakness is also his greatest strength, she replied thoughtfully. His rage makes him incredibly dangerous, but it also makes him predictable. Cain paused his practice to listen more carefully, understanding that this insight might be crucial to his survival. When Iron Hawk becomes truly enraged, he abandons strategy in favor of overwhelming force, Senna explained. He has won so many battles through pure aggression that he has never learned to adapt when opponents don't break under his initial assault. If you can survive his opening attack and frustrate his attempts to close distance, his anger will begin working against him. This information aligned with Cain's own observations of berserker fighters, confirming tactical principles he had learned through hard experience. The key would be using his saber's superior reach to keep Iron Hawk at a distance while wearing down the warrior's patience and self-control. But executing such a strategy against a master fighter would require perfect timing and nerves of steel. A commotion outside interrupted Cain's preparation, as several warriors began chanting in the Omaha language, their voices rising and falling in complex harmonies that seemed to awaken something primal in the Nebraska air. They are calling upon the spirits of great warriors to witness the combat, Senna translated, her expression growing solemn. It is a high honor, but also a heavy responsibility. The ancestors will judge both fighters according to their courage and skill. Cain felt the weight of tradition settling over him as he completed his preparations, understanding that he was about to participate in something far older and more significant than a simple fight. This combat would be judged not just by its outcome, but by the honor and skill both warriors displayed. Winning through trickery or cowardice would bring shame that could last for generations. Standing Wolf appeared in the cabin doorway, his weathered features grave as he surveyed Cain's preparations. White warrior, the medicine man said formally, the time has come for the spirits to test your worthiness. Are you prepared to face judgment in the circle of combat? Cain nodded solemnly, understanding that this was his last chance to withdraw from the challenge without losing face. I am ready, Cain replied, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his stomach. Standing Wolf studied him for long moments, apparently reading signs that Cain couldn't interpret. Finally, the medicine man nodded approval. You carry yourself like a true warrior, he said. The spirits recognize courage, regardless of the color of a man's skin. Fight with honor, and you will be remembered with respect even in defeat. The medicine man's blessing carried more weight than Cain had expected, providing a measure of confidence as he stepped outside to face his destiny. The combat circle had been transformed into something approaching a sacred space, with Omaha warriors arranged in concentric rings around the fighting area. Thunder Bear sat his horse at the northern edge of the circle, his bearing regal as he prepared to oversee the proceedings. Iron Hawk was already in the circle. Stripped to the waist and painted with symbols that seemed to writhe and move in the shifting sunlight, his massive frame was covered with scars that told the story of countless battles, each mark a testament to his survival and skill. The tomahawk and knife at his belt gleamed with deadly promise, their meteor iron edges reflecting light like captured lightning. Cain entered the circle from the opposite side, his saber hanging loose in his right hand as he studied his opponent. With the calculating gaze of a professional soldier, Iron Hawk was larger than Cain had expected. Standing at least 6 inches taller and outweighing him by perhaps 50 pounds, but size could be a disadvantage as well as an asset, particularly in a fight where speed and endurance would be crucial. Thunderbear raised his hand for silence, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd as he spoke the formal words that would begin the combat. "Warriors of two peoples," he announced, "you have chosen to settle your dispute through trial by combat, according to the ancient laws. Fight with honor, show courage in the face of death, and let the spirits judge who is worthy of victory." Standing Wolf stepped forward, carrying a small pouch of sacred herbs, sprinkling them around the perimeter of the fighting circle while chanting in the Omaha language. The ritual seemed to charge the very air with electricity, creating an atmosphere of expectation and dread that made Cain's skin crawl. When the medicine man finished his preparations, he withdrew to the edge of the circle and raised his staff. "Let the combat begin," Standing Wolf declared, bringing his staff down sharply against the earth. The sound seemed to release both fighters from invisible bonds, allowing them to begin the deadly dance that would determine their fate. Iron Hawk immediately began circling to his left, his movements fluid and predatory as he tested Cain's reactions to his presence. Cain maintained his position in the center of the circle, his saber held in a classical guard position that kept the point threatening, while allowing quick transitions to attack or defense. He watched Iron Hawk's eyes rather than his weapons, having learned long ago that a fighter's intentions were usually telegraphed by his gaze. The Omaha warrior's dark eyes burned with confident fury, showing no trace of doubt or fear. The first exchange came suddenly as Iron Hawk feinted a charge, testing Cain's nerve and reaction time. Cain held his ground, adjusting his blade angle slightly but refusing to commit to a premature response. Iron Hawk nodded approvingly, apparently recognizing that his opponent understood the subtleties of combat timing. The circling continued, both fighters probing for weaknesses while the assembled warriors watched in tense silence. Iron Hawk's second feint was more aggressive, bringing him close enough for Cain to smell the bear grease painted on his skin. This time Cain responded with a measured thrust that forced the warrior to retreat, establishing the effective range of the saber's longer reach. Iron Hawk's eyes flashed with what might have been respect as he adjusted his strategy to account for his opponent's weapon advantage. The psychological phase of the combat stretched on for several minutes, each fighter taking the measure of his opponent through subtle movements and reactions. Cain could see Iron Hawk's impatience growing as the warrior's preferred tactics of overwhelming aggression were neutralized by his opponent's disciplined positioning. Finally, Iron Hawk's control snapped and he committed to his first real attack. The charge came with explosive speed that caught Cain off guard. Despite his preparation, Iron Hawk's tomahawk swept in a vicious arc toward Cain's head while his knife thrust toward the rancher's ribs in a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm any possible defense. Cain barely managed to parry the tomahawk with his saber while throwing himself backward to avoid the knife, his heel catching on a rough patch of ground that sent him stumbling. Iron Hawk pressed his advantage ruthlessly, following up his initial attack with a series of brutal combinations that forced Cain to give ground steadily. The tomahawk seemed to be everywhere at once, its meteor iron edge carving deadly arcs through the air while the knife darted in. Like a striking snake, Cain's saber work became increasingly desperate as he struggled to maintain any kind of effective defense. The assembled warriors erupted in savage approval as Iron Hawk's assault drove Cain to the edge of the fighting circle, their voices rising in a primal roar that seemed to feed the berserker's fury. Cain felt his heel touch the rope marking, the boundary, and knew he was moments away from being forced outside the circle, which would mean automatic defeat according to the rules Thunder Bear had established. Desperation drove Cain to attempt a risky counterattack, dropping low and thrusting his saber toward Iron Hawk's midsection in a move that left him vulnerable to the descending tomahawk. The gamble paid off as Iron Hawk was forced to abort his attack to avoid being spitted on the saber's point, giving Cain the precious seconds he needed to regain his footing and establish proper distance. Cain's successful counter-thrust had bought him precious breathing room, but Iron Hawk's fury only intensified as the berserker realized his opponent possessed genuine skill rather than mere desperation. The Omaha warrior's eyes blazed with renewed rage as he adjusted his tactics, abandoning his initial overwhelming assault in favor of a more calculated approach that utilized his superior strength and endurance. Cain could see the shift in Iron Hawk's strategy, understanding that the most dangerous phase of their combat was just beginning. Blood streamed from a shallow cut on Cain's left shoulder where Iron Hawk's knife had found its mark during the opening exchange, the wound burning like fire but not hampering his sword arm. More concerning was the growing ache in his wrist from repeatedly blocking the tremendous impact of Iron Hawk's tomahawk strikes, each collision sending shockwaves up his arm that threatened to numb his grip. The meteor iron weapon carried devastating force that no ordinary steel could match indefinitely. Iron Hawk began a new pattern of attack, using his tomahawk to probe Cain's defenses while keeping his knife in reserve for decisive strikes. The warrior's experience showed in his patience, no longer trying to end the fight with a single overwhelming assault but instead working methodically to wear down his opponent's stamina and concentration. Cain recognized the shift and knew he needed to alter his own strategy before Iron Hawk's superior conditioning became a decisive factor. The Faye, Nebraska sun had climbed higher during their combat, turning the fighting circle into a furnace that sapped strength from both warriors with merciless efficiency. Sweat poured down Cain's face, stinging his eyes and making his grip on the saber's handle increasingly precarious despite the leather wrapping. Iron Hawk seemed less affected by the heat, his larger frame and lifetime of conditioning in the harsh plains climate giving him a significant advantage as the fight prolonged. Cain decided to take the initiative, launching a series of lightning-fast thrusts designed to force Iron Hawk backward and disrupt the warrior's methodical approach. The saber's point darted like a striking rattlesnake, seeking gaps in Iron Hawk's guard while maintaining the distance advantage that was Cain's primary tactical asset. Several thrusts came dangerously close to penetrating the warrior's defenses, one actually slicing through the decorated buckskin of his leggings. Iron Hawk's response was swift and vicious, his tomahawk sweeping in a horizontal arc that would have decapitated Cain if the rancher hadn't dropped into a desperate crouch. The meteor iron blade passed so close overhead that Cain felt the wind of its passage, a reminder of how quickly the combat could end if he made even the smallest mistake. Cain rolled sideways as Iron Hawk's knife descended toward his exposed back, the bone handle actually striking the ground where his spine had been an instant before. The crowd's reaction to these near-fatal exchanges was electric, Omaha warriors shouting encouragement to their champion, while expressing grudging respect for the white man's unexpected resilience. Thunder Bear watched the proceedings with the focused intensity of a military commander, his experienced eye reading the ebb and flow of combat with professional appreciation. Standing Wolf chanted continuously in the background, his voice weaving protective spells around both fighters. According to ancient tradition, Cain's legs were beginning to feel heavy as the combination of heat, stress, and constant movement took its toll on his endurance. He had fought longer battles during the war, but never under conditions this physically demanding or with stakes this personal. Every movement required perfect timing and placement. A single error would result in immediate death rather than the minor wounds that cavalry combat typically produced. Iron Hawk seemed to sense Kane's growing fatigue and pressed his attack with renewed vigor. His tomahawk and knife working in perfect coordination to close off escape routes and force his opponent into increasingly desperate defensive positions. Kane found himself giving ground steadily as Iron Hawk's assault intensified. The warrior's superior strength beginning to tell as the combat entered its critical phase. A particularly vicious combination nearly ended the fight as Iron Hawk's tomahawk hooked Kane's saber blade while his knife thrust toward the rancher's exposed ribs. Kane managed to twist away from the knife thrust, but lost his grip on the fendue saber, the weapon spinning away to land several feet outside his immediate reach. Iron Hawk roared in triumph and charged forward for the killing blow, his tomahawk raised high for a devastating overhead strike. Kane's salvation came from an unexpected source as his cavalry training reasserted itself in the moment of maximum danger. Instead of trying to retrieve his saber, Kane drew the military-issue knife from his boot and met Iron Hawk's charge. With a technique learned in desperate hand-to-hand combat during the war, the move caught Iron Hawk completely off guard, his momentum carrying him into Kane's blade even as his own tomahawk descended. Both men staggered apart, each carrying new wounds that changed the dynamic of their confrontation entirely. Kane's knife had opened a long gash across Iron Hawk's ribs, while the warrior's tomahawk had carved a deep furrow in Kane's scalp that sent blood streaming down his face. For a moment, both fighters swayed on their feet, the accumulated damage and exhaustion threatening to end the combat through mutual collapse. Iron Hawk was the first to recover his composure, shaking his head like an angry bull and advancing with his weapons, ready despite the blood flowing freely from his wounded side. But Kane could see something had changed in the warrior's eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Iron Hawk had never faced an opponent who could match his ferocity while maintaining tactical discipline, and the experience was shaking his confidence. Kane retrieved his saber while keeping his knife ready in his left hand, the two-weapon combination giving him new options for both attack and defense. The change in his tactical approach seemed to unnerve Iron Hawk, who had built his reputation on overwhelming opponents before they could adapt to his assault style. Now he faced a fighter who was not only surviving but actually learning from the exchange. The pattern of combat shifted again as both warriors acknowledged the increased lethality of their situation. Every exchange now carried the potential for immediate death, requiring perfect technique and split-second timing from both participants. Kane's military experience began to assert itself more strongly as the fight moved into this phase, his training in multiple weapon systems giving him advantages that Iron Hawk's single-minded focus on traditional weapons couldn't match. Kane launched a complex attack sequence that utilized both his weapons and coordination, the saber engaging Iron Hawk's tomahawk, while his knife sought openings in the warrior's defense. The technique was one he had perfected during desperate fighting in Tennessee, where Confederate cavalry had developed similar dual-weapon tactics. To counter Union saber charges, Iron Hawk found himself forced to retreat for the first time in the combat. The psychological impact of being driven backward was evident on Iron Hawk's face as his legendary confidence began to crack under the pressure of facing an opponent who refused to be intimidated. Kane pressed his advantage ruthlessly, understanding that this might be his only opportunity to seize the initiative before Iron Hawk's superior conditioning reasserted itself. The saber and knife worked in perfect harmony, creating a web of steel that Iron Hawk struggled to penetrate. Iron Hawk's response was to unleash the full fury of his berserker heritage, abandoning all defensive considerations in favor of an all-out assault designed to overwhelm Kane's coordinated attack. The tomahawk and knife moved with incredible speed and violence, their meteor iron edges carving the air in patterns that seemed to defy human reaction time. Cain found himself retreating once again as Ironhawk's desperate fury created openings in his previously impenetrable defense. The tide of battle swung back and forth with each exchange, both fighters operating at the absolute limits of their skill and endurance. Cain's face was a mask of blood from his scalp wound, while Ironhawk's side showed dark stains where his injured ribs continued to leak. The assembled warriors watched in awed silence as two master fighters pushed each other beyond normal human limitations. Standing Wolf's chanting reached a crescendo as the spiritual energy of the combat circle seemed to intensify. The medicine man's voice calling upon ancient powers to witness this unprecedented display of warrior skill. Even Thunderbear leaned forward in his saddle, his experienced eye recognizing that he was witnessing a battle that would be remembered and retold for generations. Cain made his decision in a moment of perfect clarity, understanding that the combat could not continue much longer without both fighters collapsing from exhaustion and blood loss. He abandoned his defensive positioning and committed everything to a single, coordinated attack that would either end the fight or cost him his life. The saber thrust toward Ironhawk's heart, while the knife swept upward toward the warrior's throat. Both weapons moving with desperate precision, Ironhawk met the attack with his own final gambit, his tomahawk descending toward Cain's skull, while his knife sought the rancher's stomach in a double strike that would ensure mutual destruction if both attacks connected. Time seemed to slow as the four weapons converged in the center of the fighting circle, their trajectories creating a deadly geometry that would determine the fate of everyone involved. The collision of steel on steel rang across the Nebraska plains like a church bell, the sound seeming to hang in the air long after the weapons had completed their deadly dance. When the dust and confusion cleared, both fighters stood frozen in the aftermath of their final exchange, the outcome uncertain until one of them began to sway and collapse. Cain's legs gave out first, sending him to his knees as the accumulated damage and exhaustion finally overwhelmed his ability to remain upright. But Ironhawk followed a moment later, his eyes wide with shock as he looked down at the saber blade protruding from his chest. Just below his heart, Cain's desperate thrust had found its mark, while Ironhawk's tomahawk had passed harmlessly over the rancher's ducked head. Ironhawk remained standing for several heartbeats, his proud spirit refusing to acknowledge defeat even as his life's blood poured out onto the Nebraska soil. When he finally fell, it was with the dignity of a great warrior accepting his fate, his weapons still clutched in hands that would never release them in life. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Cain's labored breathing and the whisper of wind across the plains. Thunderbear dismounted slowly and approached the fallen fighters, his weathered face showing deep respect for both men despite the outcome. Standing Wolf hurried to Cain's side, his experienced hands checking for wounds that might prove fatal despite the apparent victory. The medicine man's expression was grave as he worked, understanding that surviving the combat was only the first challenge Cain would face. Standing Wolf's skilled hands worked quickly to staunch the flow of blood from Cain's scalp wound, the medicine man's weathered fingers applying pressure and herbal poultices with the efficiency of someone who had treated countless battle injuries throughout his long life. Cain remained conscious but dazed, his vision swimming from blood, loss and the shock of having survived a combat that should have killed him. The assembled Omaha warriors maintained their respectful silence, understanding that they had witnessed something extraordinary that would be spoken of around council fires for generations to come. Thunderbear knelt beside Ironhawk's still form, his powerful hands gently closing the fallen warrior's eyes, before beginning the ritual prayers that would guide his spirit to the hunting grounds of his ancestors. Despite the political complications that Ironhawk's death would create, the war chief showed genuine grief for a man who had been both ally and friend for many years. Ironhawk had died with honor according to the ancient laws, and that honor would be remembered regardless of the circumstances that led to his defeat. The political ramifications of the combat's outcome were staggering in their complexity and far-reaching consequences. Iron Hawk's death would shatter the carefully negotiated alliance between Thunder Bear's band and the northern Omaha tribes, potentially destabilizing the entire region's balance of power. Standing Wolf, the northern war chief who had been Iron Hawk's father, would undoubtedly view Kane's victory as an act of war rather than legitimate combat, creating the possibility of a bloody conflict that could involve dozens of tribes. Senna approached the combat circle slowly, her movement still hampered by her injuries, but her expression showing a mixture of relief and apprehension. She understood better than anyone the political earthquake that Kane's victory had unleashed. Knowing that her father would now face impossible choices between honoring ancient law and maintaining tribal unity, as the daughter whose refusal to marry had set these events in motion, she bore responsibility for consequences that stretched far beyond her personal freedom. Thunder Bear rose from beside Iron Hawk's body and approached Kane with the measured pace of a leader weighing momentous decisions. The war chief's weathered face revealed nothing of his thoughts, but Kane could sense the internal struggle between personal honor and political necessity that was tearing at the Omaha leader. "White warrior," Thunder Bear said formally, his voice carrying across the silent gathering, "you have won fairly. According to our laws, the woman's Senna ghost horse is yours by right of combat." Kane struggled to his feet despite Standing Wolf's protests, understanding that this moment required him to show strength rather than weakness. Blood still seeped through the medicine man's bandages, and his left arm hung nearly useless from tomahawk damage, but he forced himself to stand tall as he faced Thunder Bear. "Great Chief," Kane replied with as much dignity as he could muster, "I fought for Senna's freedom to choose her own path, not to claim her as property. The victory gives me the right to ask for her hand, but the choice to accept remains hers alone." The statement sent ripples of surprise through the assembled warriors, as Kane's words challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of marriage alliances and women's roles in tribal society. Thunder Bear's eyes narrowed as he considered the implications of Kane's declaration, recognizing that the white man was offering a compromise that might preserve both honor and political stability. If Senna chose to marry Kane willingly, the alliance benefits could still be achieved while avoiding the appearance of forced submission. Senna stepped forward into the combat circle, her movement steady despite her obvious pain and exhaustion. She looked first at her father, then at Kane, her dark eyes reflecting the weight of a decision that would affect not just her own fate, but the future of her entire people. "Father," she said in the Omaha language, her voice carrying clearly in the still air, "this man has proven his worth through courage and honor. If he will have me as his wife, I will accept him gladly." Thunder Bear's relief was visible despite his efforts to maintain chiefly composure, understanding that his daughter's willing acceptance of Kane would legitimize the alliance transfer and prevent the political chaos that a forced marriage might have created. But the war chief also recognized that significant challenges remained, particularly in managing Standing Wolf's inevitable fury when news of his son's death reached the northern bands. "The union will be recognized according to our laws," Thunder Bear declared. "But first we must address the consequences of Iron Hawk's death." As if summoned by Thunder Bear's words, a cloud of dust appeared on the northern horizon, marking the approach of a large group of mounted warriors riding hard toward the ranch. Kane squinted through his blood-crusted vision and counted at least 50 riders, their war paint and weapons clearly visible even at a distance. Standing Wolf had apparently been following Iron Hawk's progress and was arriving to witness what he expected to be his son's triumphant victory over the white kidnapper. Thunder Bear's expression grew grim as he recognized the war party's composition and understood the volatile situation that was rapidly developing. Standing Wolf was a proud and violent man, who would not accept his son's death with the philosophical resignation that Omaha tradition demanded. The Northern war chief would likely demand blood payment for Iron Hawk's death, potentially triggering a conflict that could devastate both bands and destroy the fragile peace that had taken years to establish. "Senna, you and the white man must leave immediately," Thunder Bear said urgently, his tactical mind already calculating the best way to manage the approaching crisis. "Take horses and ride south toward the white settlements. Standing Wolf's grief will make him dangerous, and I cannot guarantee your safety if you remain." Kane started to protest, understanding that fleeing would make him appear cowardly and might undermine everything they had just accomplished through honorable combat. But Senna grasped the political realities more clearly than Kane, recognizing that their presence would only inflame Standing Wolf's rage and make peaceful resolution impossible. "My father is right," she said firmly, her voice cutting through Kane's objections. "Standing Wolf will want immediate revenge for his son's death. If we are here when he arrives, no amount of honor or legal justification will prevent bloodshed that could destroy both our peoples." Standing Wolf began issuing rapid orders in the Omaha language, his warriors immediately moving to implement defensive positions around the ranch while preparing horses for Kane and Senna's escape. The medicine man finished bandaging Kane's wounds with practiced efficiency, understanding that the injured fighter would need to ride hard despite his condition. Within minutes, the organized chaos of emergency preparation had transformed the peaceful morning into a scene of barely controlled urgency. Kane found himself mounted on Thunder Bear's own warhorse, a magnificent stallion whose speed and endurance were legendary among the Omaha bands. Senna rode beside him on a fleet mar, selected for its ability to carry a wounded rider over long distances without faltering. Their hastily packed supplies included weapons, food, and medicine, but Kane understood that their survival would depend more on speed and luck than careful preparation. Thunder Bear approached Kane's horse and placed a weathered hand on the stallion's neck, his eyes meeting the white rancher's with an expression of profound respect. "You fought with honor today," the war chief said quietly, "and you have given my daughter the greatest gift a man can offer a woman, the freedom to choose her own destiny. For this, you will always be welcome among the Omaha people, regardless of what politics and pride may demand in the coming days." Kane felt the weight of the war chief's words, understanding that he was receiving an honor rarely granted to white men in this era of conflict and mistrust. "Thank you for your wisdom and fairness," Kane replied, extending his hand in the white man's gesture of respect. Thunder Bear grasped it firmly, sealing a bond of mutual respect that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. Senna embraced her father briefly, both of them understanding that this might be their final meeting depending on how the political situation developed. "Live well, my daughter," Thunder Bear whispered in Omaha, "and remember that you carry the pride of our people wherever you go." Senna nodded wordlessly, tears streaming down her face as she prepared to leave everything she had ever known. The approaching war party was close enough now that individual riders could be distinguished, their war cries echoing across the plains as they spotted the gathering around the ranch. Standing Wolf rode at their head, his massive frame radiating barely controlled fury as he searched for his son among the assembled warriors. When his eyes fell on Iron Hawk's covered body, his roar of grief and rage could be heard across miles of open prairie. Kane and Senna spurred their horses into a gallop, racing south toward the distant line of hills that marked the beginning of white settled territory. Behind them, they could hear Standing Wolf's war party arriving at the ranch, their angry voices rising as Thunder Bear began the delicate process of explaining what had transpired. Kane knew that the Omaha war chief faced an almost impossible task in preventing immediate retaliation while maintaining his own people's respect and loyalty. The chase began almost immediately as several of Standing Wolf's younger warriors broke away from the main group to pursue the fleeing couple. Kane could hear their war cries growing closer despite the head start Thunder Bear had provided. Understanding that their superior knowledge of the terrain would eventually allow them to overtake their quarry, the horses were running well. But both riders were injured and the pursuit would be relentless. Senna guided them toward a series of narrow canyons that might provide temporary concealment, her intimate knowledge of the landscape offering their only hope of evading capture. Kane followed her lead without question, trusting her judgment despite his own military experience in escape and evasion. The canyon walls rose around them like protective barriers, muffling the sound of their horses' hooves and providing blessed relief from the open prairie's vulnerability. But their pursuers were too skilled and determined to be permanently thwarted by geographical obstacles. Within an hour, Kane could hear the echo of hoofbeats in the canyon behind them, growing steadily closer as Standing Wolf's warriors closed. The distance, the chase had become a deadly race against time, with their lives hanging in the balance as they struggled to reach safety before being overtaken by grief-driven vengeance. As they emerged from the canyon system into rolling grassland, Kane could see a line of blue-uniformed cavalry riders approaching from the east. The sight filled him with relief and apprehension in equal measure. Understanding that while the soldiers might provide protection from Standing Wolf's warriors, they would also represent a new set of complications and challenges. The frontier was no place for simple solutions, and every rescue carried the seeds of future conflicts. The approaching cavalry column consisted of 2 full companies of the 7th Infantry, their blue uniforms and brass buttons gleaming in the afternoon sun as they rode in perfect formation across the Nebraska grassland. At their head rode Captain William Morrison, a veteran officer whose weathered face and confident bearing spoke of years spent maintaining peace along the volatile frontier. Morrison had received reports of tribal movements in the area and was conducting a routine patrol when his scouts spotted the dramatic chase unfolding across the prairie. Kane raised his hand in the universal signal for parley as the cavalry drew closer, hoping that Morrison would recognize him as a fellow white man rather than another hostile to be dealt with. Summarily, Senna remained mounted beside him, her proud bearing and obvious injuries telling their own story to the experienced officer's trained eye. Behind them, the pursuing Omaha warriors had stopped their advance upon seeing the soldiers. Understanding that attacking under such circumstances would bring devastating retaliation against their entire tribe, Captain Morrison rode forward with a small escort, his hand resting casually on his saber hilt as he studied the unusual scene. Before him, "I'm Captain Morrison's 7th Infantry," he announced formally, his voice carrying the authority of federal law in a region where such authority was often theoretical rather than practical. "Are you in need of assistance, sir?" Kane felt relief wash over him as he recognized the professional competence in Morrison's manner, understanding that he was dealing with a soldier rather than an Indian-hating zealot. "Captain, I'm Kane Ridgway, and this is Senna Ghosthorse," Kane replied, choosing his words carefully to avoid triggering unnecessary complications. "We've just fled from a situation involving tribal politics and blood feuds. Those warriors behind us are pursuing us for reasons that have more to do with honor than actual criminal activity." Morrison's experienced eye took in the blood-stained bandages, the quality of their horses, and the obvious desperation of their flight. Morrison studied the distant Omaha warriors through his field glasses, noting their disciplined positioning and restraint in the face of superior firepower. "Those are Thunder Bear's people," the captain observed, his knowledge of regional tribal politics immediately evident. "They're not normally hostile, but they're also not known for backing down from matters of honor." What exactly happened to bring Standing Wolf's northern bands into this? Kane realized that Morrison's familiarity with tribal politics could work either for or against him, depending on how the story was presented. There was a formal challenge over the woman's betrothal to a warrior named Iron Hawk. Kane explained carefully. The challenge was fought according to tribal law, and Iron Hawk was killed in single combat. Now his father Standing Wolf wants blood payment, regardless of the legal circumstances. Captain Morrison's eyebrows rose as he absorbed the implications of Kane's statement. In his years on the frontier, Morrison had seen many conflicts arise from the collision between tribal customs and American territorial expansion, but he had never encountered a white man who had actually participated in formal tribal combat. He fought Iron Hawk in single combat, Morrison said, his tone carefully neutral. That's either very brave or very foolish, depending on one's perspective. Senna spoke for the first time since the cavalry's arrival, her voice steady despite the exhaustion and pain that showed in her face. Captain Morrison, Kane Ridgway saved my life and fought honorably to prevent my forced marriage to a cruel man. He has done nothing that violates either tribal law or American justice, but Standing Wolf's grief has made him beyond reason, and he will not stop pursuing us until blood has been shed. Morrison studied Senna with the careful attention of a man accustomed to evaluating the credibility of diverse witnesses. Her obvious education and articulate speech impressed him, as did the dignity she maintained despite her circumstances. Miss Ghosthorse, are you here of your own free will? Morrison asked directly, understanding that her answer would determine how he handled the situation. I am, Senna replied firmly. Kane has offered me freedom to choose my own path, something that few women in any culture can claim. The captain's decision-making process was interrupted by the arrival of a dust cloud from the north, marking the approach of a much larger group of riders. Morrison's scouts quickly identified the newcomers as Thunder Bear's main war party, apparently attempting to intercede before the situation escalated beyond control. The convergence of three armed groups in the same location created exactly the kind of powder keg situation that Morrison had been trained to defuse. Thunder Bear rode forward under a flag of truce, his dignified bearing and obvious leadership, qualities immediately apparent to Captain Morrison. The two leaders met in the neutral ground between their respective forces, both understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether the situation ended peacefully or exploded into violence that could affect the entire region. Captain, Thunder Bear said in carefully pronounced English, I come to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. Morrison dismounted and approached Thunder Bear with the respect due to a recognized leader, understanding that frontier diplomacy required acknowledgement of tribal sovereignty within traditional boundaries. War Chief Thunder Bear, Morrison replied formally. I'm honored to meet a leader whose reputation for wisdom extends throughout the territory. How can we resolve this situation without violence? Thunder Bear's relief at finding a reasonable white officer was evident, despite his stoic demeanor. The white man Kane fought my daughter's intended husband in honorable combat and won fairly according to our ancient laws, Thunder Bear explained, but Standing Wolf grieves for his son and demands blood payment regardless of legal justification. I seek to prevent a conflict that would benefit no one and could destroy the peace our peoples have worked years to build. Captain Morrison found himself in the complex position of mediating between tribal factions while protecting American citizens and maintaining federal authority in the region. His solution demonstrated the diplomatic skills that had made him successful in frontier postings. War Chief, what would Standing Wolf accept as appropriate compensation for his son's death, short of Kane's life? Morrison asked, opening negotiations that might satisfy honor while preventing bloodshed. Standing Wolf himself arrived at that moment, his grief-stricken features and aggressive posture making clear his state of mind. The Northern War Chief rode directly to where Thunder Bear and Morrison were conferring, his eyes blazing with fury as he spotted Kane among the cavalry escort. White dog, Standing Wolf snarled in broken English, you kill my son, you die. No talk, no payment, blood for blood. Morrison stepped between Standing Wolf and Kane, his authority backed by 2 companies of federal troops who were now deployed in defensive positions. Chief Standing Wolf, Morrison said firmly, Kane Ridgway is under the protection of the United States Army. If he fought your son in legal combat according to tribal law, then no crime has been committed under either tribal or federal jurisdiction. I cannot allow summary execution of an American citizen. The standoff that followed was fraught with the potential for catastrophic violence as Standing Wolf's warriors faced off against Morrison's disciplined soldiers. Kane realized that his personal conflict had escalated into an international incident that could affect relations between the United States and the Omaha Nation for years to come. The weight of responsibility for so many lives pressed down on him like a physical burden. Senna made the decision that broke the deadlock, dismounting from her horse and walking directly towards Standing Wolf, despite the obvious danger. Her courage in approaching the grief-stricken war chief impressed everyone present, particularly Morrison's soldiers who had rarely seen such bravery from civilian women. "Standing Wolf," she said in the Omaha language, her voice carrying clearly across the tense gathering. "Your son died as a warrior should, with honor and courage. His spirit has already joined the ancestors in the hunting grounds beyond." Standing Wolf's fury wavered as Senna continued speaking in their native tongue, her words apparently carrying cultural weight that transcended the immediate political situation. Kane couldn't understand her exact words, but he could see their effect on the assembled Omaha warriors, many of whom began nodding in agreement with whatever she was saying. Thunder Bear's expression showed growing hope as his daughter's intervention began changing the emotional dynamics. She reminds Standing Wolf that Iron Hawk died in honorable combat, which means his spirit is with the ancestors rather than wandering as it would if he had been murdered or killed through treachery. Thunder Bear translated quietly for Morrison's benefit. She also points out that Kane fought with courage and skill, proving himself worthy to carry Iron Hawk's memory through marriage to the woman Iron Hawk had claimed. This transforms the situation from murder to legitimate succession. The cultural reframing that Senna provided offered Standing Wolf a way to accept his son's death without losing face or abandoning his obligations as a father. Kane watched the internal struggle play out on the war chief's features as grief warred with practical politics and cultural tradition. Finally, Standing Wolf's shoulders sagged as he accepted the inevitable reality that his son was gone, and that vengeance would not bring him back. "White warrior," Standing Wolf said finally, his English halting but understandable, "you fight with honor. My son dies as warrior should die, but you take his place. You take his responsibilities. You protect woman. You protect alliance. You prove worthy of warrior's death." Kane understood that he was being offered a chance to transform tragedy into honor, accepting obligations that would bind him to Omaha society for life. Kane stepped forward and faced Standing Wolf directly, understanding that this moment would determine not just his immediate fate, but his entire future relationship with Senna's people. "Standing Wolf, I accept the responsibilities that come with victory," Kane said solemnly. "I will protect Senna with my life, honor the alliance between our peoples, and prove myself worthy of the trust you place in me. Your son's courage will be remembered through the children we raise and the peace we maintain." The formal acceptance of responsibility seemed to drain the last of Standing Wolf's rage, leaving only a grieving father who had found a way to honor his dead son while preserving the future. Captain Morrison recognized the diplomatic breakthrough and moved quickly to formalize the resolution before anyone could reconsider. "Gentlemen," Morrison announced, "it appears we have reached an honorable settlement that respects both tribal law and federal authority." Thunder Bear stepped forward with a proposal that would cement the new alliance while addressing practical concerns. "Captain Morrison," the war chief said formally, "I invite you to witness the marriage ceremony between my daughter and Kane Ridgway according to both Omaha and white traditions. Such a union, blessed by representatives of both governments, would create bonds that could benefit all our peoples." Morrison immediately recognized the diplomatic value of Thunder Bear's suggestion, understanding that a formal ceremony witnessed by federal troops would legitimize the union while demonstrating American respect for tribal customs. I would be honored to represent the United States at such a ceremony. Morrison replied, When and where would you propose to hold this wedding? The ceremony took place 3 days later at Fort Robinson, with Captain Morrison's chaplain conducting the Christian portion, while Standing Wolf himself performed the traditional Omaha rituals. The unusual combination of military protocol and tribal custom created a unique celebration that drew participants from across the region. Kane wore his dress cavalry uniform while Senna was resplendent in wedding garments created by the women of both Omaha bands working together. The political significance of the marriage extended far beyond the personal happiness of the bride and groom, creating a precedent for peaceful cooperation between white settlers and tribal peoples that would influence regional policy for decades. Kane's acceptance of Omaha customs and responsibilities challenged prevailing assumptions about cultural assimilation, while Senna's willing marriage to a white man demonstrated the possibility of voluntary integration rather than forced submission. 6 months after the wedding, Kane and Senna had established a new ranch on land provided by Thunder Bear's band, creating a unique settlement that served as a bridge between two cultures. The ranch became a stopping point for travelers, traders, and diplomats, with Senna serving as an interpreter and cultural advisor, while Kane managed the practical aspects of frontier agriculture. Their success demonstrated that cooperation and mutual respect could overcome even the deepest cultural divisions. The birth of their first child, a son they named Thomas Thunder Ridgway, marked the beginning of a new generation that would grow up comfortable in both worlds. Kane often reflected on the chain of events that had begun with a rescue from Snake Gulch and led to a life he could never have imagined. Senna had found not just freedom, but partnership, while Kane had discovered that true courage sometimes meant abandoning everything familiar to embrace an uncertain but worthy future. As autumn painted the Nebraska landscape in brilliant colors, Kane and Senna sat on their porch watching the sunset while their infant son slept peacefully between them. The scars from their desperate beginning had faded into memories that strengthened rather than haunted their relationship. In the distance, they could see the smoke from Thunder Bear's village, a reminder that they were part of something larger than themselves. Do you ever regret the choice you made? Senna asked quietly, her hand finding Kane's as they shared the peaceful moment. Kane considered the question seriously, thinking of the quiet life he had abandoned and the comfortable isolation he had traded for responsibility and connection. Never, he replied finally, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had found his true purpose. Some things are worth any risk, and love is the greatest of them. The wind carried the sound of children playing in Thunder Bear's village, their laughter mixing with the evening songs of birds settling into roost. Kane and Senna had built more than a marriage. They had created a bridge between worlds, proving that understanding and respect could overcome even the deepest cultural divides. Their story would be told around council fires and family hearths for generations, a testament to the power of courage, honor, and love to transform the most desperate circumstances into hope for the future.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.